It's 1998, and I certainly don't know what hard work looks like yet. Google is just getting started. I'm not really sure Apple's web technology got much better than this. But I definitely think they hit peak marketing here. Titanic also hit the box office that year. And here, Leo, about 25, is still older than most of his recent girlfriends. It was also the year Tiger brought us the Furby, the first successful attempt at an interactive robot pet. The playground was a frenzy, and it was all everyone was talking about. And here ensued the Christmas riots of 1998. Furby went on to sell 40 million units in 24 languages in the first 3 years alone. Impressive even by any today's standards, where viral marketing is cheap and relatively easy. So thanks everyone for coming. At this session, I'm going to talk about my journey reverse engineering the Furby. I hope there'll be a little bit something for everybody here. We all come from different backgrounds. I'll share the setups that I used to explore Furby's capabilities. I'll dip into the original 1998 source code that powered the Furby and people called the learning machine. And I'll talk a bit about Furby's best kept secret, a sophisticated analog state machine that enabled it to become the toy of the millennium. I'm Luke McNeice, and with a mechatronics background, I started off at Nortel, building automated test tools for embedded software for critical ISP infrastructure. As a grad, I joined McNeice and worked on early mobile technology, a lot of kind of early iOS, early Android. And later, I led research and development there and worked on a lot of junior talent and mentored a lot of junior people. Now I lead engineering at a company called Hamilton Robson, and at least our software division is relatively new. So we're software engineers and technologists, and we mostly focus on digital transformation and creative problem solving with our kind of audio-visual sister company beside us, working with a lot of customers like Twitter, Coinbase, Warner Brothers, just to name a couple. Some of the current enterprise projects that we're working on, just to give you a flavor, is a recruitment automation platform for construction, fan insights for pro musicians, and a real-time room analytics project that's actually a little IoT hardware kind of software split project, which has really been really interesting and it's been taking most of my time recently. Some of the creative projects that I've been working on includes an interactive longbow that feels real, being part of the team that delivered Oliver Jeffers' Our Place in Space that you might have all seen up at the Davis Mountains this summer, and a studio for kids that you might have, if you have any cousins or nephews or sons or daughters, you might have seen at the W5. And it's what we often don't tell people is actually underneath the hood of what the kids are playing with in that studio is actually a full-blown professional news studio that actually W5 and the Odyssey actually used to do news as well. So I really mean it when I say that creativity is a really important part of our everyday work. You should also check out one of my colleague Chloe's talk, and she's talking a little bit later about one of the recruitment platforms that I was mentioned, and it's at 5 p.m. at Hall 1B. You should definitely check that out. So I'm sure you're wondering how I got here. But for me, actually started in 2014. This is my son, Sam. Here 3. And after a nostalgic car boot sale find, my sister, still traumatized by me continually hiding her Furby when we were younger, of course for maximum jump scare effect, brought one home. And naturally, Sam was pretty happy about that. We named him Jeff. It was all going really well until I put batteries in him. There was tears shortly after this. So what is any father to do? So I took a walk to the bottom of the garden, Furby in hand, dug out the tools I needed, and dissected the little demon. Jeff, to be clear. And for boy, watching this, it worked. His curiosity and starting off a now routine tradition of science lessons at home. And of course, it only was once Furby was on bits on my kitchen table that San leaned in and whispered, "You can't talk now, Jeff." So wanting to kindle that STEM spark got me thinking, what would it take to make Furby talk? I actually wasn't a fan of this model of Furby, the one that Sam had. It was something about the eyes. Sometimes eyes are all you need. And with the original Furby having such expressive eyes, using that original Furby was a no-brainer. If it passes the meme test, it's all good. So a few eBay purchases, a couple of donations later, thanks Duddy, there was a prototype. Then there was lots of prototypes. And with each one, I was trying to figure out how to control individual components and maximize that expression. Mostly focusing on the mouth, but I kind of evolved over that year. But it was all very performance-led, in a kind of very traditional, like engineering way. I just didn't really have a goal. And after a year of this, everyone was looking a bit worse for wear. And I was lost. So what does an engineer do when they're lost? Of course, they build a new JavaScript framework, but that didn't really help here. So when I'm lost, I write documentation. And as it often does, it helps me step back to see a bigger picture. And it made me think, why do we have to do any of this? Was it possible to keep Furby intact? It seemed like such an obvious question now. So let's change it up and have a look at some of the original source code. And it's not as boring as it sounds. It's actually some little interesting little bits into it, but let's jump in. So just a little bit of an intro. So actually only leaked only a handful of years ago. And Tiger kept the secret for so long. Not sure what the backstory was to how it leaked, but it wasn't too long ago. It is assembly, but it's extremely well documented. And in fact, you can even see things like little wisps of code reviews and things in some of the comments and things. It's about 297 pages long, which actually for assembly isn't that much. But in fairness, there's quite a few files that for sure aren't there. One file in particular is the firmware for the Texas Instruments chip that you can see at the bottom there. And it is actually for speech synthesis. And Furby is one of the kind of slightly later products in that kind of cycle that use this chip. And if anybody watches *Halt and Catch Fire*, it's a great show if you haven't watched it, by the way. The character Donna was kind of like early when you first got introduced to her. She was kind of like a technical savant, and one of her key projects was actually working on a speech synthesizer chip. And I feel like that was actually the chip that kind of inspired like that character. One also little interesting thing was that because it used this kind of 6502 assembly, a lot of people thought that it had to have used the Apple II chip, basically that was for that. And nobody really knew because of the little black resin you can see on top. And that was actually a really interesting artifact of a lot of like 80s and 90s electronics. And basically it was a way of protecting your IP. And because the only way to attack this was to kind of like whittle down that resin with some really dangerous acid and take an X-ray machine and X-ray it basically at the transistor level. So it was really, really difficult to reverse engineer. But the firmware revealed actually it wasn't that Apple II chip, and it was a kind of cheaper younger sister of a chip, but it's still assembly. So this one's a pretty easy one to start with. If anybody had a Furby, they'll probably remember that everybody talked about what was its name, and some people just made names up, of course, but the gospel, at least in the source code, there was 24 names. Really interesting here was that it got selected on first boot completely randomly. I'm going to talk about the random number generator in a second because it's kind of funny and crude and some interesting things there. Also the pitch of its voice, one of 3 pitches got selected on random boot. And also the names were actually Furbish words. So apparently there's like some pseudo language. And I can imagine that, when the Furby was first created, that there must have been such an amazing creative team that was part of like the technical team that kind of brought that lore all the way through into the product. And you can see that actually in some of the really interesting behaviors in the code. So one of the slightly more interesting things that people used to talk about in the playground at the time was, what they got the Furby to do. And there's a lot of like really interesting mystery around whether you could do it. And certainly for me, I was probably a little more impatient. I was like, I can't really quite get it working. And certainly this table, I've just extracted from the code. It shows you all the different things that you have to do. So for example, a feed is, its mouth sensor. A tickle is its stomach sensor. And a pet, for example, is its back sensor. One of the interesting things from here was the twinkle one. So it's basically where it sings twinkle, twinkle. And it's the only one that does this, but basically it goes into a deep sleep after that in a way that you can only wake it up again if you completely invert it. Like it has to be perfectly straight up. And all the rest of them don't do this. And I was thinking about like, why did they do that? And the only thing I could think of, it was almost like a pseudo parental lock. You can imagine almost this toddler was like waking the Furby up in the middle of the night and you're like little demon. And, but you get into our bedtime routine where you kind of sing Twinkle, Twinkle. And then the toddler can't really figure out how to wake it up during the night. I thought that was really interesting. Who knows? Also, generally, actually, the code, the source code is the link there. The code of these are actually surprisingly small. Often a lot of these kind of programs are quite complicated, but are no more than 50 lines of code, except for Simon Says. I think like about 20% of the whole program is Simon Says. It's incredibly complicated. It uses the microphone and, all those kinds of things. So for a long time, a lot of people said that Furby, the reason why it was so popular was because it was a learning machine and that it was able to learn English from you. And one of the really interesting things that I found when I was looking at the source code is I couldn't find any of that. But what I did find was a bunch of really clever cheats. And for example, like when it first booted, it set up a bunch, I've never seen this before, like for a toy, it first set up a bunch of weightings, like random weightings. And it also, and I thought this was really strange until I figured out later, which I'll talk about in a second, of why even it weighted the sensors. And what I mean by that is how sensitive its light sensor would be if you tried to play hide and seek with it, for example. And I couldn't really understand. I did this with all of the sensors. You can see it when the program first boots. And there was a really funny story that came in the news, I think in the early 90s, of like getting Furbies to swear. And but actually it was, of course it was all rubbish, but they did have to make a formal legal statement about it. But the reason why they knew it was rubbish, of course, was that they just had this really clever learning rate, and where they had a kind of basically a file of Furbish and English words for every year that it was old, and it increased, and it was just a reference table basically. But then it also used this kind of 25% kind of probability to select from one of the list, and it created this like organic sense that it was kind of growing and changing. And the biases, the weightings that it set up at the start also meant that no Furby was the same. And so going back to the sensors, for example, so weightings here, the way I think it was used was you could actually get a Furby that was particularly wired or particularly tired based on, like a lethargic and wasn't really responding to things, and that was his personality. And board time was kind of interesting. So, for example, it had this kind of really short board time. It had also really long board time. And again, that was weighted at the start. And so you could kind of get this really chilled out Furby or this really like neurotic, intense Furby, or somewhere in between. And one of the things I also thought was quite funny is I found this change log, because what I realized when I was kind of stepping through some of the board code was that basically if you consistently make the Furby bored, it will get sick. And when it gets sick, it blocks your ability to play a game with it. It just basically exits the game routines almost immediately. And you can see that what they've had to actually do is, add this kind of you're not allowed to get like basically this sick, because it ended up kind of falling into a rut. And then obviously the child was like, I can't fix this. And then it kind of went in the pile. So I thought it was kind of interesting. And food was the only way to recover from Mac's sick. I thought that was interesting. So my experimental setup. So this is probably the most technical part of the talk. I'm not going to go through all of these, but certainly my preference, if you've used microcontrollers, you'll recognize the Teensy. I use it because it's just blazing fast compared to any microcontroller on the market for its price. You're probably talking about £30 for something that is like 200 times faster almost than anything else in the market. And it basically allows me to be lazy. And a lot of object-oriented code that runs in the cloud, we don't really have to think about, for example, whether or not you're getting near your only 1 kilobyte of RAM and things like that. And also an awful lot of microcontroller architecture is it's basically a really crude, and it's like a loop, and it just does what you tell it to do. But if you have anything that you want to kind of go off and do something else, it can block your code really, really easily. It's hard to track down bugs. And basically with the Teensy just being really fast, it just gives you a load of fat to play with there that doesn't stop you making mistakes. I'm not going to go into those, any others. The only other thing, I don't use this on Furby, but certainly for hardware in general, the Teensy is particularly unique in that it has this USB hosting client capability. So basically what that is, a fancy way of meaning is that it can emulate any USB device, whether it's a host or a client. And you can imagine all of the evil things that you can do with a bit of hardware that's only this size that can appear to another device as anything at once. And it can even hot swap. On the software side, I kind of mentioned earlier that one of the challenges when you're working with Arduinos, which is often the biggest community when you start kind of playing with this kind of stuff, is that you're taught to write everything in a loop. It's almost the complete opposite of what you're taught around normal OOP programming. And basically it causes lots of problems when you start to scale your program. So I use a scheduling approach. If anybody's interested in this thing, please come and talk to me after. I've got this nice little test framework that I've got going. I'll probably release it very soon with some of the Furby source I've been working on. But yeah, basically a scheduling-based queues, hardware, still using hardware interrupts, and just to track Furby's mechanical state. Okay, so Furby's secret. So as I was saying earlier, sometimes it takes you to lose your way before the right path emerges. And that new goal for simplicity led to Furby's secret. And it was this kind of realization of the difference between these things. Yes, I'm being a little bit facetious with these things, but compared to, for example, this, the Sony Abido, I think it was called, dog, and it was $3,000. It was, it was a small batch. It had a lot of capabilities. It could walk and stuff. I could do that through having lots of motors and lots of sensors and those kinds of things. But the Furby had all of these emotional capabilities. It was very engaging. It had a very expressive face. It had eyes. It had ears. It could rock it back, and it seemed to just have such a low price point. How did they do it? And it only had one motor, as it turned out. So when I opened it up, I had this clarity, and this motor was connected to this little white thing, this little white sandwich. And the answer had to be this. But I didn't imagine that it would be anything like this. So the best way to describe what an analogy for this is, imagine that you take a clock and that a clock, and on the hands of the clock that you decide that a body part is doing something. And that controls both encodes the timing and the motion of that body part. That's, for example, the first little disc there. That second piece, which looks a little bit longer, is the piece effectively that does the actuation. So if you imagine the disc is effectively turning, so the motor is kind of turning it, and this little part is almost like connected into it, and it follows this little groove effectively, which gives it this one dimension of motion, but it encodes motion and timing. And then stack all those clocks basically on top of each other, and they all interact with each other in novel ways as well. And basically it's a really complicated mechanical analog state machine. in a tiny little space. And also you can see that once you take it apart and set it upright, it kind of looks like a little bit of a bird skeleton over on the right. I thought that was quite funny. And all of this combines together to give Furby its really complex behavior. Sorry about the scribbles and the notes, but you can kind of see what I was trying to do here is like map, this kind of ear and eyelids and the mouth and the rock where the waist are lean back, and kind of what they were doing at all times. And in this drawing I had my board many years ago was kind of more, I thought about it more like it was a single clock, and that all of these effectively different expressions interacted to have a full macro expression on its face at any one time. And effectively what happened then as it woke up, it kind of cycled through basically a bunch of expressions and often just stopped and then changed direction and stopped and changed direction or followed through to try and get to the macro expressions that it was trying to do. So anyone who's worked with hardware before will very quickly say, well, what happens when your wheels or your clock skip? Or how do you know where you are? And how do you know whereabouts in the wheel you are? And there's two answers to that. And the first one is relative tracking. So how Furby does this is basically, so this is a very unflattering pose for Furby, but you can see I've got like basically an endoscope up there. And another kind of fun thing is like this video is actually my iPhone running in slow-mo mode. This is like 200 odd frames a second, and it's still too fast to capture on a normal camera. This is going blazing fast. So it's actually about 8 microseconds. This little hole in the wheel kind of passes a light. So the kind of schematic here, I've tried to depict that where this motor drives the encoder. And the encoder is just a fancy way of basically saying a wheel with holes in it. And then there's a light on one side of the wheel that shines through, and then a sensor on the other. And obviously as the wheel goes through, it goes dark light, dark light, dark light. And that happens at 8 microseconds every time. So it's super impressive for something this old to be able to keep up at that speed, and also do it while it's doing all of these other things like speech synthesis. And you can see the kind of some of the architecture challenges there. So the problem with relative tracking is it's a bit like this. It's a bit like, so what that gave us was the ability to understand that our hands of our clock are moving and where they are. So for example, since we started, but we don't know where we started. And we don't know where the actual numbers of the clock ever were. So how do we do that? So the short answer is calibration. So for example, a 3D printer will do it by, when it warms up, you'll see that it will basically just drive itself into the wall until it hits the wall and kind of go, okay, I'm at the wall now. I will count from now on. And basically Furby does it very, very similarly. And basically on one of the expression gears, it's the middle one actually, it has this tiny little tooth that's on the back. And it's about here. And as it goes round, basically that tooth basically bumps a button. Now it doesn't quite look like a button, but it might as well be. And effectively what happens is that basically goes, that's me home, that's me zero, now count from now on. And I'm sure they're calibrated in the, as they get produced, but actually the really clever thing is that as Furby wakes up and yawns, this kind of like classic yawn that it did as it woke up, it actually was in the middle of calibrating itself to find the home as well. So they thought about that too. So that's all I have time for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this session. I have lots of other things to talk about. And if anybody else wants to see any hardware or kind of wants to help me build this, I'll be releasing some source code soon. And I have lots of prototypes to play with, but I didn't have time to show you the all today. So thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your conference.